Why has Vladimir Putin consistently avoided engaging in direct talks with Ukrainian leadership?
He doesn't have the charm and charisma and the genuineness that Zelensky has.
Ukrainian strikes on Russian oil refineries have caused greater damage to Russia's economy than any international sanctions.
So he's claiming that this would exacerbate, tensions with the U.S. if we provided Tomahawk missiles.
Zelensky, who arrived in Washington on Thursday afternoon, had been very optimistic in recent days about his planned meeting with Trump. Surprise moves in diplomacy. Trump's talk with Putin and unexpected plans for a meeting in Hungary catch Zelensky off guard. We will talk about this with David Tafuri, international lawyer and former U.S. State Department official. David, glad to see you, and thank you for joining us.
Great to see you. Thanks for having me.
David, President Donald Trump has announced a bilateral meeting with the Kremlin dictator Vladimir Putin in Budapest following a telephone conversation between the two leaders. Why was Budapest chosen as the venue for this meeting, and what symbolic or geopolitical significance does it carry, particularly in light of Hungary's positioning within NATO and the EU? What are the stated objectives of the upcoming Trump-Putin meeting in Budapest, and how do they align with current U.S. foreign policy priorities?
The optics on the selection of the site for the next Trump-Putin meeting are not good. It's hard to understand why the U.S. would want to meet Putin in Hungary, which is the one country in Europe, part of the EU, more than any other, that seems to have some affinity for Russia, seems to make excuses for the war crimes that Russia has committed inside Ukraine. And so there was no reason to have to do this meeting in Hungary. Remember, Putin has already demonstrated a willingness to travel anywhere to do a meeting with Trump, because he came to Alaska, to the United States territory, to do a meeting with Trump. So there was no reason why they needed to pick some neutral air place where Putin is even more comfortable. But that's what happened, apparently. And you have to worry a little bit about how Viktor Orban, the head of Hungary, might also influence these discussions.
David, Axios notes that Zelensky, who arrived in Washington on Thursday afternoon, had been very optimistic in recent days about his planned meeting with Trump and the U.S. president's willingness to provide Ukraine with long-range Tomahawk missiles. However, shortly after Zelensky landed at Andrews Air Force Base, the Ukrainian president and his team were surprised to see Trump's statement that he had spoken with Putin and agreed to meet him in Hungary. How can we interpret this development in the context of ongoing requests for advanced weapons systems such as long-range Tomahawks?
Well, President Zelensky has to take advantage of this opportunity to meet with President Trump today. He has to stay on message and continue the very good effort he's made since that disastrous meeting in the Oval Office in February to find common ground with President Trump, to provide President Trump with honest, genuine briefings that help him understand the situation in Ukraine, and in particular, what's happening on the battlefield with Russia. He's been successful lately in bringing Trump to his side, and so he shouldn't let the fact that Trump is going to be meeting with Putin deter him from continuing that effort and keeping the momentum going with the increasingly good relationship between the Trump administration and the Ukrainian government.
In your opinion, how should the U.S. interpret this messaging from Putin, if we talk about Tomahawks, as a genuine strategic warning or as a part of a broader disinformation and intimidation campaign?
I think it's more of the latter. This is what Putin does. Anytime there's something that he doesn't want the U.S. or the European allies of Ukraine to do, he says this is going to be a red line, and if we cross it, it could increase tensions between our countries. But then he actually never follows through, and he's a bit of a paper tiger on things like this. So he's claiming that this would exacerbate tensions with the U.S. if we provided Tomahawk missiles. But he's said that before about ATACMS, about Patriot missiles, about other things that we have done, and then he never took any action against the U.S. So I think President Trump, I hope, will listen to Putin, nod his head, and ignore any threats that Putin makes, because Putin doesn't have the positioning and the capacity right now to take on the U.S. and Europe. He desperately wants to get the U.S. and Europe to provide less to Ukraine. That's why he's trying to do this.
Yes, President Trump has stated that his country has many Tomahawk missiles, but they also need them. Quote, we need Tomahawks for the United States of America too. We have a lot of them, but we need them. I mean, we can't deplete our country. You know, they're very vital. They're very powerful. They're very accurate. They're very good, but we need them. And how might this statement affect Ukrainians' expectations of deeper U.S. military support, especially as the country prepares for intensified defense operations during winter?
Well, President Trump is right that we need to be concerned about our own security, and we need to keep our own weapon stockpiles up for our own defense against any potential threats. And we need to be constantly alert and have the capacity, the weapons we need to defend ourselves. But I have some skepticism that the U.S. doesn't have sufficient stockpiles to transfer some Tomahawks to Ukraine. And the U.S. should also be pushing defense contractors who make weapons like the Tomahawks, like the Patriot missile systems, to increase their production or restart production in certain cases. And if the U.S. hasn't done that already, we certainly should be doing that. We know that our allies are going to need these weapons, and we need these weapons. And so the U.S. has the resources, the financing, the technological capacity to ramp up on the production of these weapons that, in my view, are essential to Ukraine.
About Zelensky and Putin meeting, we see that, for example, White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt has said that U.S. President Donald Trump still believes in the possibility of a meeting between Ukrainian and Russian leaders to bring an end to Russia's full-scale aggression, full-scale invasion, given repeated public statements in favor of negotiations. Why has Vladimir Putin consistently avoided engaging in direct talks with Ukrainian leadership for now?
I think he's avoided direct talks because he understands that he's not going to win in a discussion about what should happen with respect to Ukraine and Russia if Zelensky is present. He has no more, he doesn't have the charm and charisma and the genuineness that Zelensky has. And so he prefers to try to work one-on-one with President Trump without others present who are pushing the Ukrainian side of things in order to influence Trump. So he doesn't want President Zelensky there. He doesn't want any European leaders there who could also make the case for Ukraine. This is what he thinks he can do. I would also say the other reason he doesn't want to do a meeting is because I don't think he's serious about having a ceasefire. He has not made one concession in all of these discussions about what a ceasefire might look like with Ukraine. He hasn't backed off even an inch on the things that he's demanding that Russia should get. And these things are things that are unacceptable to Ukraine and should be unacceptable to Ukraine, including he wants not only parts of the eastern provinces that he invaded in Ukraine, but he wants to take parts he doesn't even control yet because the Ukrainian armed forces have successfully defended them. So that's unacceptable. And until he starts making concessions, there's no reason to think that a three-way meeting between Trump, Zelensky, and Putin would actually be successful.
David, during the meeting in Alaska on August 15th, U.S. President Donald Trump wanted to make a deal with Russian dictator Vladimir Putin to end the war, but he rejected the offer and began a long, historic speech that embarrassed the American leader. This was reported by the British Financial Times, which spoke to 8 Western and Ukrainian officials and diplomats, as well as people in Moscow who know the content of the conversation between Putin and Trump. What extent is Putin using his history and ideology as a tool to deflect diplomatic efforts and stall negotiations under the guise of cultural or national unity?
Well, this is a typical part of his approach as well, which is he tries to claim, based on historical facts, that Ukraine and Russia have always been together and that it's one country, that there's no separate Ukrainian culture. Obviously, Ukrainians know very well that this is the Putin point of view, but he has to bend facts in order to do that. And he makes very misleading statements about what happened historically. Ukrainians know better than anyone their own history. They're not going to be influenced by this. But unfortunately, people outside Ukraine who haven't been to Ukraine, haven't spoken to Ukrainians, who don't know the history of Ukraine, they can be influenced by this. And so Putin has had some success, unfortunately, with his disinformation campaigns like this, which mislead people about the origins of the war with Russia and why Russia invaded Ukraine.
David, also, yes, President Donald Trump has said that now is not the best time to impose new sanctions against Russia, as it could complicate or even derail his planned meeting with Russian dictator Vladimir Putin. What are, in your opinion, the main reasons behind President Trump's reluctance to impose sanctions at this moment? How does the potential meeting between President Trump and dictator Vladimir Putin influence the timing of sanctions?
I don't understand why President Trump said that, because at other times he has said correctly that instituting new sanctions on Russia and what he calls secondary tariffs, which would punish the countries and the companies from countries that are helping Russia sell its oil around the world, would have a significant impact on Russia's economy. So President Trump understands that. And there are many in the Trump administration, and by the way, also many in Congress, including many Republicans who are from President Trump's party, who believe the only way to get Putin to agree to a fair ceasefire and settlement is if there's more pressure put on his economy. So it's the institution of sanctions that is likely to put more pressure on Putin and cause him to be more reasonable at the negotiating table. And in my view, it's not just the sanctions. It's the sanctions plus increasing the support in terms of weapons and equipment that Ukraine needs. If both of those are done together in parallel, that's what is likely to cause Putin to say, I can't win this war, and I'm suffering too much, and my people are suffering too much, and my economy is in the tank. And that it could possibly bring him to the negotiating table.
David, Kirill Budanov, head of Defense Intelligence of Ukraine, believes that Ukrainian strikes on Russian oil refineries have caused greater damage to Russia's economy than any international sanctions. How significant is the economic impact of Ukrainian strikes on Russian oil refineries compared to international sanctions? And how have these strikes affected Russia's oil production and export capabilities?
I think he's right. And based on what international observers are saying, it is having a significant impact on Russia's economy, although it hasn't yet changed the conduct and actions of Putin as the commander-in-chief of Russia. They continue to, make attacks on Ukraine and continue to launch offensives against Ukraine. So far, even though I believe that Russia's economy is hurting because of those strikes on the oil sector and the oil facilities in Russia, it hasn't changed behavior. But this is why things like providing tomahawks, which would allow Ukraine to strike much deeper into Russia and hit some of the oil facilities and oil infrastructure they have not been able to hit yet, could be the type of thing that changes the situation and does cause Putin to realize that he needs to get a ceasefire.
Some Indian oil refineries are preparing to reduce imports of Russian crude oil after U.S. President Donald Trump said that India has assured him of its intention to stop purchases to help end the war in Ukraine. What are the main factors influencing Indian oil refineries to consider reducing imports of Russian crude oil? How significant is India's commitment to stop purchasing Russian oil in the context of global efforts to end the war in Ukraine?
To me, this is very important because India is the world's largest democracy. And even though it's a democracy, it has more in common with the United States, with Ukraine, with the West. It somehow has been playing both sides. And getting India, which is also the largest country in the world in terms of population and has great needs for resources, oil and gas, to getting India to be less dependent upon Russia and to understand and recognize that its future economic relationships with the United States and Europe are much more important than its economic relationship with Russia is essential to removing a buyer of Russian oil and gas that is providing a lot of the revenues that Russia is using to build up its war machine and continue the illegal war in Ukraine. And there's just no reason why India, which is our friend, the United States friend, a longtime ally, and a democracy, should be supporting Russia in this way. And President Trump is right to use sanctions and what he calls secondary tariffs on India to coerce India into reducing its purchases of gas and oil from Russia.
What about China? Because I see that Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent will speak by phone on Friday with Chinese Vice Premier to discuss the ongoing trade negotiations between the United States and China, as a near-Trump administration official told CNBC's. Additional details about the call, including the specific time it would take place or the next steps to be discussed, were not immediately clear.
It's hard to know what China is going to do because, as you correctly said, China has a lot of different disagreements with the United States. And the negotiations between the U.S. and China and the diplomacy between our two countries is on a broader array of issues than just Ukraine, although Ukraine is an important part of those discussions. But because of the tariffs and because of disagreements over trade and the trade imbalance that the U.S. has with China, and also criticisms by the U.S. of things that China does that are unfair, like stealing intellectual property from the U.S. and from U.S. companies, there is a lot to try to work out with China. Now, President Trump says he has a really good relationship with President Xi. And so when they do sit down together, if they do meet in person, and there have been discussions about a meeting in person happening soon, he needs to use that relationship and that friendship to try to get China to be more on the sidelines of the war in Ukraine. And China isn't directly providing a lot of significant weapons to Russia, but we know China is providing component parts and equipment that is essential to Russia. And also, we know that China, like India, is one of the biggest purchasers of oil and gas, and that's fueling the Russian economy.
David, and also about NATO security, NATO will not allow Moscow to violate borders. In the event of new provocations, Russian aircraft must be shut down, says Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney. What are the reasons behind NATO's current lack of direct military action in response to repeated Russian provocations? Because we see drones, aircrafts, submarines.
Well, NATO has the NATO countries whose airspace have been invaded by Russian drones. They have authorized shooting down those drones. They've shot down some Russian drones. I think this woke everybody up around the world that the things that Ukraine was saying about how Russia won't stop in Ukraine if it's successful in Ukraine are true and genuine, because the fact that Russia is testing the borders of other countries, including the Baltic states and the Scandinavian states, which are part of NATO, shows that he wants to see if he can take more territory, to have more influence, operate on these sovereign countries in violation of international law. And so NATO collectively would be wise to take any provocation seriously and to respond and retaliate in order to send a message to Russia that this is unacceptable, and that if Russia continues, it could result in more hostile actions between NATO as a collective force and Russia.
And in general, to what extent does the fear of escalation into full-scale war limit NATO's operational options?
Well, that's always been out there as a reason why, NATO should be careful. But as we've seen since the invasion in February 2022, Russia is hesitant to take action that is actually going to incite retaliation by NATO. It's NATO that holds the cards. The U.S. and and other NATO allies. We have much stronger, more powerful militaries than Russia. Collectively, we have so much more access to resources because if you put together the GDP of all of our countries that are part of NATO, it dwarfs what Russia has as, I think, the 11th largest GDP in the world. And so we need to exercise more robustly the power and the position we have to try to restrain Russia.
David, thank you so much for an insightful conversation, and we appreciate your time, your expertise. And to say that David Tafuri, international lawyer and former US State Department official, was with us today. Guys, thank you so much for watching this video. Like and subscribe, and also see you.
Дякую. Слава Україні.
Героям слава.